Yes. So our plan for today is we're going to talk about the state of aphasia and the revised, the updated report that we heard just a bit about. So we're going to jump into that. The moderators today, myself, Michelle Armour, Lynn Brady Wagner, Jackie Hinckley is part of our committee as well that had organized this. However, she is still in Iceland from Nordic, so she sends her regards, but she's looking at waterfalls and other things. So you might remember 2018, Todd was just talking about how we have this kind of historical narrative on the YouTube channel and beyond. 2018 was when the aphasia in North America was called the White Paper came out. Nina Simmons-Mackey wrote a really comprehensive report on the state of aphasia in North America. I have some slides here of the ASHA in 2018 when Liz and Ruth presented in person. Nina was online presenting a bit as well. And that was the first version of the paper, 2018, that came out and really put together a great deal of information in one place. Fast forward to March of 23 at the Aphasia Access Leadership Summit, where we heard portions of the revised paper, the second paper, and that being the volume 2.0. And that was with Nina, as well as with an added co-author, Dr. Jamie Azios. And together, she and Nina have put together a really impressive revision, modification, and addition to the original State of Aphasia paper. So here's what the current State of Aphasia paper, the research paper, holds. Here's the table of contents, and you can see the 10 chapters, a deep dive into all things aphasia. And Nina and Jamie have been working tirelessly on this. We're going to talk specifically about chapters 5 and 6 today. You'll be able to have some information about where the paper is and how to access and the availability and so on at the end of our presentation. But one of the things that we really wanted to stress was both our gratitude to Nina and Jamie, and also the importance of this paper as a one-stop shop for providing really an updated state of aphasia. So we're excited to do it. We were fortunate to look at some of the pre-draft copies, and we're pretty amazed that I think the one chapter was 80 some pages long. There are 40, 50 pages of references. So Jamie and Nina know the tireless work they've done. So here's what our plan is for today. We wanted to, again, emphasize a couple of the aspects of chapters 5 and 6, look at the gap areas, and then also talk about collaborative solutions, what people are doing. So we want to just moderate, kind of start the conversation. We're not presenting full content for the hour, but rather we just wanted to provide a couple kind of keynote parts of what the paper has, because we had a chance to look at it, but then learn and listen from all of you that are in attendance. So we thought we'd start with just 2 of the quotes from the start of the paper. The first quote you can read online: individuals with communication difficulties are at a significant social disadvantage. You know that if you're somebody with aphasia, that you may have some social disadvantage because of the communication difficulty. We see that as people like myself who don't have aphasia, but work with individuals with aphasia. The disadvantage is particularly experienced in those sectors where effective communication is critical: healthcare, education, local government, and justice. So we know those things. And one of the really positive aspects of the paper that Nina and Jamie did such a great job is there are solutions and there's evidence that we can do something. So ample evidence that communication be improved by implementing relevant communication support. So that's exciting. And within both our conversation today, as well as in the paper, there'll be gap areas identified, but there's also some discussions about solutions, potential actions that can be done. So chapter 5 is impact of aphasia. Here are some of the ways and the areas that the impact of aphasia is addressed comprehensively. Chapter 6 is communication access, and access across settings, across individuals, and then also solutions across from the individual to macro policy level kinds of solutions. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Michelle. I'll be the one that advances some of the slides, but Michelle will take us from here to talk about participation.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Armour, and I'm really excited to lead the discussion on the impact chapter. As Tom kind of alluded to, the impact chapter addressed numerous areas that aphasia impacts not just the person, but also their family and society. So it was a really, really interesting chapter to read, as he mentioned, extremely thorough. And we just did not have time, as you could see from that chart, to talk about all of the areas. But given Aphasia Access, we're all here because of Aphasia Access, and Aphasia Access is driven by the need for person-centered care and life participation approach. We thought participation would be a nice place to begin our discussion. So at the beginning of the chapter, there was one piece of information that we found shocking and we wanted to highlight, and it was related to just general quality of life. But as you can see here, aphasia was reported as having the largest negative impact on health-related quality of life out of 60 diseases and 15 health conditions. So obviously, with this in mind, discussing the impact on person, family, and society is crucial, and that is one of the reasons why we're here today. One of the things that I personally really enjoyed about these chapters is that as you go through, you find really powerful quotes from people living with aphasia, such as this one. So the quote is awful because sitting there, and then home, and then. So just really driving home why we need to talk about this. Hearing these quotes, reading these quotes that were embedded in the chapters, I just felt like I heard more about the patient experience and why reading this really important material, talking about the gaps is so important and such a big reason for us to be here today. So some research summary points in terms of participation, the participation section. Obviously, it continues to be reported the fact that reduced life participation continues to be a long-term consequence of aphasia. We're probably all aware of the fact that there is evidence that reports individuals with aphasia post-stroke report less participation than those post-stroke without aphasia. Furthermore, the impact chapter reviewed research that just dove a little deeper into participation and found that specifically the participation activities that individuals with aphasia report that they participate in were really mostly home-based activities, like watching TV or being with family. Whereas in that same study, where those without aphasia were reporting that they were participating in more community-based activities, despite the fact that they also had a stroke. So beyond the obvious issues of lack of participation, there's just many gaps in services that are still being reported. And this paper did an excellent job just reviewing a lot of these gaps. To be clear, there's a very thorough summary in the chapter reporting the research on all of these gaps. And these are just a few highlights to include to kind of get our discussion rolling today. So one, the fact that most goals for by speech language pathologists are written specifically for the aphasia impairment itself. That still is continuing to happen. And there's research that has done survey data and things like that, looking at what these goals are. And it's still, most of them are the aphasia impairment, not participation. Also, there's many institutions that are still primarily using the medical model versus person-centered care. There's also been some studies that interview SLPs and have found that there's just a false understanding in the clinical world that acute care or inpatient rehab is too early to address participation. And of course, there's concerns about reimbursement for participation-based goals, of which we know is also a false understanding. So we know that participation is reimbursable. So knowing these issues are still occurring and there's further evidence outlining the gaps in service, we really want to open it up for discussion. As Tom mentioned, there's so much we could talk about the paper, but we really want to focus on solutions. So we'd love to hear from you. What are you doing in your clinical practice or in your life? If you're a person with aphasia, what are you doing to participate more? Or if you're a professional, what are you doing to increase participation targets in your sessions with your patients? Also curious if you feel you have any barriers to incorporating participation into your sessions. And if so, what are they? And maybe we can have a discussion around how we can get by those. And if you are using participation as a goal for your sessions, wonderful. I'm curious, what kind of outcome measures we use that you might use when you're considering participation as your goal for treatment. So this part, we just want to open it up, and please, whatever ideas you have, we'd hope for a really nice open discussion around this idea of participation.
So if people have things they'd like to share, comments, thoughts, if you would just go ahead and raise your hand physically or your icon, or you can put something in the chat, and then we'll go around the horn and make sure that we can get to people as well regarding thoughts on participation.
I'm always hesitant to go first, right? Because we gotta get the conversation moving. Lynn?
I'll jump in. I often wonder about the continuum of care and how we can talk to one another across a continuum of care as we build treatment programs that help to facilitate participation in the community from day one, as you were mentioning. Sort of this notion of participation can't happen until somebody's out of outpatient therapy and back in the community in a community program. And of course, we know that's not the case. How do we really help the frame of clinicians understanding how to help our patients and family members engage in that right away? And, what kinds of activities, what kinds of formats and, cohorts do we have to begin talking about that?
That's a good point. Thanks, Lynn. Carol, you had your hand up or had a comment as well?
Just a really short one. And that was that it was sort of interesting. I was on a call with a bunch of people with aphasia the other day, and I gave them an open sentence. I said, what does aphasia affect? Because we always think the answer is reading, speaking, numbers, all of this. And somebody blurted out, life. And I think if we can all remember that aphasia affects life so profoundly, that those life goals have got to be part of service delivery models across the board. We have to think not only about their language skills, but their well-being. So if you're ever in doubt how important it is, I still can hear this yelling. Life is so true.
Yeah, much more than language, for sure.
So for me, I work in a large healthcare system. I'm specialized to aphasia in an aphasia center, but I've been an inpatient here. I've been an outpatient here in the past, and I think it's like the research shows. It's just kind of this false stigma. I think that a lot of clinicians feel that they really need to do things, by the book and, everything that they were taught in school. And I don't think the schools, because we don't have a lot of experience yet. I know when I was in graduate school, just kind of getting started, it takes a lot of creativity, and you have to know that it's very loose. It's whatever's best for the patient if you're using that person-centered care. So for me, it's the easiest thing to do now. But I think for our hospital, we really try to drive that into our students. We are a teaching hospital. And I think if we can really start when they're learning how to write their goals, and when the students are learning how to provide these therapies, not just focusing on traditional evidence-based practice, of course we need that, but really showing them how they can be creative and incorporate these participation-based goals that are so critical to the patient and their well-being at that early stage. Because once we learn how to do things, we start to do things like that regularly. And I think it's so important that it just becomes part of the care you provide every single day, even whether it's a patient who has aphasia or not. It's just such a critical thing. And I think that education piece early on is just really critical.
Good point.
We did have a couple solutions. I don't know, Tom, if you want to share that slide.
Yep.
We can go on to those if there were no other comments. So there's obviously a lot out there. A lot of the SLPs on the call are probably very familiar with these things, but there is the Living with Aphasia Framework for Outcome Measurement, so AFROM, that is meant to be used in discussions of goals with patients and family. That's one very simple thing you can just start to implement in your practice to touch upon the participation piece of the care that's provided. And also just to be really collaborative in terms of goal setting. So to collaborate with the patient and their family. That's what it takes. We don't know what the participation goals are until we have this collaborative goal setting discussion. So there's great tools for that as well. The Live cards is one of them. Dr. Haley has the fork model that really goes through and talks about how to collaboratively set goals for participation and otherwise with patients and families. But I think it's just also wherever you are to create opportunities within the system that you work, within the community. It takes a little creativity, but that's really what it needs to happen. And I know that's what we're really trying to do here at our hospital. We have created support groups. We try to schedule regular outings. I had one person who his big participation goal was playing chess. He used to play chess regularly. After his stroke, after he acquired aphasia, he didn't play anymore, and he really wanted to get back to that. So we created an aphasia chess club. It wasn't sponsored by our hospital. I just helped kind of create it, and they would go to the library every Friday in town here, and they played on their own. And it was easy to do. It just took a couple phone calls, but it helped him participate in that again. Which leads me to the third point here is it took connecting the individuals with aphasia and their families. We have another group. I introduced them all, and now they regularly go twice a month to the Arboretum. They go meet at the local golf club and just walk the grounds. Like, they have all of these outings that aren't led by a professional anymore, but it's increasing their participation, and they just needed help making those connections to make it happen. We also try to really do meaningful volunteer opportunities. So we have a whole volunteer program here at Marion Joy, but also in our community where it's meaningful to the person, and we discuss what those activities might be that are meaningful to them. And we set them up with some volunteer opportunities for them to do regularly that gets them out in the community, out talking to people, and gives them the sense of leadership that they want to do, and that's important to them. So I think it just takes thinking outside the box a little bit more and then implementing those with all of the patients and people that we meet. So happy to answer any questions or have any more discussion, but otherwise I'll pass it back over to Tom.
Okay, great. Thanks, Michelle. Great points and great summaries on participation. And I think I love your ideas too, the chess club and the others. And I know that all of you that are on are doing similar kinds of ideas and thoughts or participating. One of the other points that we wanted to highlight and discuss is the idea of provider communication. And provider, as most of us now know, is kind of can even be a jargon term for anybody who's providing care. So a provider could be a physician, it could be a mid-level nurse practitioner or physician assistant, or even a rehab clinician, speech therapist, or occupational or nursing or a CNA. So we want to talk a little bit about the provider communication. And here's a quote from the paper. They scurry over and turn me. They walk away, not even putting the bed rail up. They don't want to talk. I think they feel awkward because I couldn't talk back then. They've not even tried. And that was a quote from Felicity Bright's paper. And I can see a few head nods, both from clinicians as well as from people with aphasia, that you can probably relate either personally or as a family member or even as a clinician in terms of what we've heard. Now, this is a lousily designed slide because it's a lot of stuff on it. This is about 1/1000th of what we looked at in the chapters, but just wanted to highlight what essentially tells the story of people with stroke that get admitted to hospital units. 88%, so nearly all, have some kind of communication impairment, and more than half have difficulty communicating their healthcare needs. So there's a difficulty that occurs. Physicians themselves report little training, if any, in communicating with individuals with disabilities. nurses self-report that they talk less to people with aphasia than to people without aphasia amidst everybody with stroke. So on a stroke unit, nurses admit that they talk less to people who have aphasia versus those that don't, both in acute as well as subacute settings. And then there's aspects of safety that we'll talk about later. People who have had a stroke and are in inpatient rehab, twice as likely to experience negative consequences, including even things like physical safety. So there's obviously challenges, and there's these gaps in provider communication, more adverse issues. So negative events that occur in hospitals that relate to emotional, physical, and financial harm. Those are more likely attributed to poor provider communication, whether with aphasia or without. Higher likelihood of those events occurring when communication is poor. People who have aphasia have difficulty conveying basic communication needs, pain, dietary needs, preferences, and so on. And then I think something we can all relate to, the idea of lack of time and perceived time pressure are some of, if not the primary major barriers. And one of the points that was made in the paper and that we wanted to emphasize as well are these last 2 points that are in red, because there's a lot of negative that we can say about providers. I think we've all had experiences as patients or family members of having lousy interactions with our provider. And at the same time, healthcare workers feel upset and sad that they're unable to interpret the needs of people with aphasia. So there's this realization that it's happening. So it's not solely that people are obtuse, that people aren't aware of this. They know it's happening, and there gets to be this kind of weight. Yeah, I feel bad about this. However, I've got 15 other things to do. I feel bad about this. However, I'm going to do something else. And then this idea, and this was the Caraher paper that's cited a couple of times, there's a sense, it can be a sense of dread when anticipating communicating with patients with aphasia. You also have this idea that healthcare workers can see it. They perceive that communicating with people with aphasia is frustrating, and they feel guilty for not providing adequate care. So when we talk about some of the potential ideas and solutions, part of that is thinking about how can we potentially absolve some of those or mitigate some of those negative feelings, because providers are experiencing that and they know there's these challenges that are occurring. It's not just that they're totally unaware. Now, of course, there are times where there's a lack of awareness. So we've got this challenge, all kinds of negative consequences of poor provider communication. We have staff who have challenges communicating. So it leads to, what are some of the ways that we can mitigate or we can reduce some of those demands? And we'll talk just a bit in a little bit about some of the things came up in the paper. But again, wanted to open it up to all of you because you all have ideas and ways as somebody with aphasia or as a clinician of what you can do or what you've done to address communication. And then also specifically to, what do you think motivates providers to have better communication? Because they're getting it from all aspects. You have to do this better, and this better. What do you think might motivate people? And then how can we kind of latch on to that motivation to improve provider communication? So I'm going to stop the share here and like to open it up to a couple comments or thoughts. If anybody wants to jump in, I'm just going to read, I'm going to read two of the quotes or the comments in the chat. Robin had to jump out to another meeting. Sorry, I cannot stay. Happy to hear this conversation. Works at the Aphasia Institute where the AFROM is front and center. So ideas of using, if you have questions about how to use the AFROM in goal setting, email us, and her email is there. And that's a great example of participation and actually even very much so provider communication, the language environment, and how we can help to enhance the facilitators and reduce the barriers. Before I read Jamie's comment, I just wanted to check comments, thoughts on what you all are doing to leverage or get at motivation for provider communication, some ideas that have been successful or helped. Yeah, Carol, go ahead.
I hate to say it, but in 1995, things were really shitty when David was in University of Michigan Hospital. Really, really bad. There was no awareness of aphasia. I had to stay with him 24/7, which I would have anyway, because he was 10 years old. But families feel stuck. So feeling as a care partner, I lost my job. I had to live in the hospital. It was horrible. Fast forward to 2023, not a lot has changed. So I think when it comes to motivation, one of the things that I'm doing more is I'm learning more about communication access in the ADA. I just did that podcast with the ADA. I'm attending things on the ADA. And I think we have to approach providers, not like you're doing a really crappy job, because they don't know what they don't know. So I think if we can reach out to providers in a loving way and say, people with aphasia are really struggling, here might be a few tips, and do it nicely. But at the same time, I've had people within our community where things have gone really bad. And I've said, would you like me to call on your behalf? And I think sometimes we have to play that card. We have to be willing to say, not only is it the right thing to do, but according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, this is part of our laws in this country. We build communication ramps. Everybody gets it. If I'm in a wheelchair, yeah, I'm going to get a ramp. That same ramp is needed for communication. And I think the way we're going to motivate him is with the ADA. I hate to say that, but I believe until we bite it and bite it hard, there will be no change. Because at least from my perspective as a family member, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing it anywhere. And we survey people on Aphasia Recovery Connection all the time. And we keep hearing bad story after bad story after bad story after bad story. We're not, of course, those are the people that report it. But I think consistently across the board in the United States, I think the delivery model for communication access is really poor. It's shamefully poor.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good
Sorry,
point, Carol.
sorry to be so strong, but I
No,
feel
no,
strongly about it. I
yeah.
lived it and it's
Yep.
terrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible.
Tiffany, did you have something that you wanted to add? If you go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm new here. This is like my first time, and I just recently joined Aphasia Access.
Glad you're here.
Thank you. I have a couple of this kind of what goes on what Carol said, but I have worked in every setting in healthcare, literally every setting, and I have spent a lot of time in acute care and in inpatient rehab. But I've done long-term acute care and home health. Most clinicians, in my experience, and I'm speaking to clinicians, I'm not talking nurses and doctors and all this, but just in the bubble of speech therapists. Most speech therapists, in my opinion, don't travel around to the different settings of seeing how a person operates 2 days post-stroke versus 3 months, 1 year, 10 years. And they don't have the opportunity to experience that of how to manipulate their treatment, how to set their goals, how to be creative, because they're one-trick ponies in a lot of sense, in my opinion. And so it's hard for these speech therapists to do that because in many respects, they're experientially blind to that. They have not been forced to think about those things, despite the fact they really love to help. And as you've mentioned, the time requirements are real. The one thing that I think might be helpful is if you've ever worked in inpatient rehab where they have spinal cord injuries, good inpatient rehabs will have mentors. Towards the end of their inpatient stay, they will have spinal cord people who have spinal cord injuries come in and they will mentor them. And I don't see that happening with aphasia at all. But then you also have to manage the expectations that patients and family members have, which is what a mentor does. They may not get 100%, but people want a guarantee of that, and they want certainty sometimes, and that's difficult for them to wrap their head around, which is why a mentor can be helpful. It's like drug intervention too. You got to be coached through that, and I don't think professionals have a great awareness and access to that as speech therapists, and I don't think patients have that access of what can life be like after I discharge from the hospital. I can still participate in these things.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that, I think I saw a couple nods talking about the peer mentors and the ideas. So maybe we'll go Erin, and then Karen and Liz. And thank you, Tiffany, for those really great points that you made. Those are key. Erin, would you go ahead with your thoughts?
Yeah, I just have a couple. I'm a speech therapist at Brooks. I'm also a registered nurse, and I've been doing a lot with our transition to practice nurses. So there are new grads.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of things that we've mentioned is, like, especially with nurses, they got into their field to help people.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is challenging. They say there is a deficit for how to communicate. So what we've been really doing, nurses are learn and do professionals. They learn how to start an IV, they do the IV. They learn how to do trach care, they do the trach care. It's the same thing with building in these SCA techniques. So like what we do is I go do an in-service for them and then bring them to the Aphasia Center where they have hands-on access to our members to practice. And I will be honest, one of the first cohorts, one of the nurses took care of one of our members who had been readmitted and was able to immediately use those SCA strategies. And he said it changed the whole interaction. So I think, and what I do with the nurses too, is just remind them, hey, I know you have literally 1,000 things on your to-do list. I'm gonna show you a couple things that might cut down 30 seconds off of your day in little chunks.
There you go.
And then they kind of go, oh, it's not something I'm doing wrong. It's something that I can actually do that will help this whole system. And I just remind them, you didn't learn this in nursing school. Doctors don't learn these skills, so they can't be held accountable yet for them. So those of us who are passionate about it can share this information and say, hey, this isn't your fault you don't know, but now you do, and you can advocate on your floor. I think another really important factor to keep in mind is we often as speech therapists are only working during day shifts. I think it's very important to also always offer night shift and weekend training.
Great point.
Because that's the time when especially nurses have the least access to support. So I think it's going to take a village. And something else that we've kind of started doing is I'm contacting the local nursing schools. Can I get in and do an SCA training? We're doing it with our mental health programs, but hey, can I go back to my alum university and can I do an SCA training there? So it's kind of systemic. I really want to advocate for this because they aren't taught this at all. So it's going to be part of our job to change the course of communication access to bring them all in. So
yeah,
just my 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. And I think you really reframed that well, getting away from this idea of here's another thing you have to do, another thing you have to do, but getting at like the literature said, people want to do a good job and feel good about what they're doing. So thanks for that. And those really concrete examples of what you're doing at Brooks. Karen, I think we got time for one more comment on this, then we'll keep moving on. But Karen, what were your thoughts?
Because I wanted to talk about this particular there at this point, just concerning that
Hey, Karen, hang tight. Hold up just a sec. Was it? I was having a little hard time understanding. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you just sounded a little like you had too much caffeine, maybe, but I think it was the connection.
The audio is like on 4 times speed or something.
Yeah, yes, the universal. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Karen, we're going to watch for your comments, and there's a few more in the chat as well. We are going to just go ahead and share some of the things that were discussed in the paper as well. And
yeah, and I don't know if I saw Ellen comment on the work we were doing as well. I'll just comment quickly.
Please.
We did as well. I worked with one of our past patients with aphasia. She was able to communicate a lot about her experience in acute care and inpatient rehab when she was in those levels of care. She had very limited communication. And so I saw her 2 months later in the Aphasia Center, and she was able to describe in great detail very concrete examples of things that made her uncomfortable and things that she felt very poorly about her experience as a patient. And it was heartbreaking. And so her and I did a project together, and we got some of our nursing on board, we got our clinical educators on board, and we created a training based off SCA principles, but that would be applicable to our hospital, to our employees, specifically geared towards nursing and our patient care techs that work with our nursing staff. And we made it an online module. So as Ellen mentioned, so that it was available to everyone, regardless of shift. It was also made mandatory for every single nurse and every single PCT. We then, we did some research and looked at the outcomes, and it appeared very successful. So then we rolled it out to all therapy departments, finance, down all the way to our EVS team who does our housekeeping in the patient rooms, our staff in the cafeteria who serve our patients. And so now the whole hospital has taken it, and it's also a requirement for every single new employee through the orientation process. We also have more hands-on with our patients. Our patient volunteers from our Aphasia Center, they do more hands-on training with our residents and our APRNs now, so that they can get more of the experience and the hands-on use of SCA strategies. And we simulate, emergencies and things like that, and they have to work out specific scenarios with our patients to get that hands-on. So thank you, Ellen, for mentioning it.
And if you'd like to learn more, episode 52 from the Aphasia Access podcast, Ellen has it up and queued. So awesome. That's really impressive, Michelle. Another great concrete example. That's really, really positive. And there's some questions too, Michelle, about if it's published, available, and so on.
It is published. Yes, I'll put the information in the chat.
Great. Okay, I'll share my screen briefly just to highlight a few of the solutions. And somebody holler if I'm not sharing my screen. But the positive, again, is that there are some solutions, some things that can be done. It's not just throw your hands up. A few things to point out. Again, when communication is successful with patients with aphasia, healthcare workers feel positive about their work. So coming at this, and as Aaron, as you said, where you say this is going to instill some positivity in your work and your day, it's what we all seek to do. There's a lot being done on CPT, and in some of the updates of the paper, I think 26 new CPT studies, communication partner training. Comtil Jutta Isaacson is doing some work on using that, not just in Denmark, but also throughout the world. And it's doing communication training for healthcare professionals. And there's even this example of a well-known framework like FRAME. Familiarize, reduce your rate, actively help communication, mix communication, engage the patient. So on the one side, there's a lot that needs to be done. On the other side, there are some potential solutions. You heard them just in the conversation, and certainly there's more in the chat, and there's more in the paper. So let's go ahead, though. What we wanted to do was wrap up the discussion, talking just a bit about patient safety and patient satisfaction. So I'll turn it over to Lynn to lead us in this discussion.
Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks everybody. This has been a fabulous discussion. I just want to re-emphasize, uplift Tiffany's comment about the peer mentors for spinal cord injury. I'm at Spalding Rehab in Boston, and we have used a similar framework with stroke peer visitors, who we had a training model that was developed by the American Stroke Association and then adapted it to our institution, focusing specifically on sort of the expectations, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the best quotes that I continue to say is a patient said to me once, after I left the acute care hospital, I knew I was going to survive, but I had no idea how I was going to live until I met Tom, who came and talked to me and showed me that I could flourish with aphasia. So we're going to be talking about a couple of components of this very broad category of patient satisfaction and safety under the access component. Can you switch to the next slide, Tom? Thank you. Patient satisfaction being a critical element of healthcare quality. There are key elements that promote satisfaction, such as expectations, control, decision-making, amount of time spent by the provider, and being treated with respect and dignity. Most of these core elements are associated with the quality of the interpersonal communication. Next slide. We're going to focus on a couple of areas, specifically health literacy and decision-making capacity. And I'd like to change it up a little bit. So if you have your fingers near the chat key, what I'd like to do is do something called a chat or fall. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to give you about 5 seconds to write your answer. And then I'm going to ask you to hit send. So we'll all see it at the same time. Okay. When you think of health literacy and the intersection of somebody with aphasia, what kinds of challenges do you see and anticipate? So health literacy and the intersection of somebody with aphasia. What are the challenges that you recognize in your practice, or that you've experienced, or that you know people experience? So take 5 seconds to write that in the chat. Hopefully you haven't gotten up to go take your laundry out of the dryer. Okay, hit send. Okay, so readability, not appropriate for a person with aphasia. Too much information, as we talked about, with making sure that we are framing the information based on the person's ability. Information is too complex, etc. So wanting to make sure that not only is health literacy a challenge for all people who experience and interact with healthcare, and the CDC has recognized it as a critical safety issue, and one that sort of requires standard precautions that we as providers should be required to know and understand the levels of information, how we share the information so that it can be consumed by all patients. But specifically, we know that people with aphasia will have difficulty with this. So patient fear and not knowing what's going to happen next. For example, somebody coming in to get an MRI. Thank you, Carol, for that example. How do we, describe these very detailed, complex protocols and procedures that people need and go through? What I would say in reflecting on the volume 2 paper that we're talking about today, is that it is an extraordinarily, I would say a professionally outstanding annotated resource of research and policy and information to understand the impact of aphasia on the individual, policy, and society. So in each one of these categories, there is a description of the available data and research, but really importantly, how we as a society also support with laws, with policy, with different accreditation requirements and models. Excuse me. So health literacy is widely encompassing and includes the need to communicate in a way that's understandable for the person of different cultures, of low education, of unfamiliarity with medical jargon, or people who don't speak English. So I think there's also an intersection, excuse me, with diversity of needs, with background and interaction with the health system. Excuse me. And I think something that health professionals, rehabilitation professionals, physiologists in particular, have an obligation to make sure that persons with disabilities, persons with aphasia, are considered in that group, that we have a place at the table so that we're creating solutions that meet the needs of persons with aphasia. Next slide. Excuse me. The second component that we wanted to raise here in this section is decision-making capacity. I had the great good fortune of doing training in clinical ethics at the University of Chicago when I was living in Chicago, working at what was then the Rehab Institute of Chicago. And as a new clinician, there were two important aspects of our work that were very important to me and instigated a lot of ethical questions. One of them was dysphagia and making recommendations for limitation of life-sustaining treatment, not making those recommendations, but being involved in decisions where that was being discussed. And really most important and prominently was seeing my patients who had communication impairments being left out of critical informed consent conversations. And so I guess how many of you, please raise your hand virtually, have experienced yourself or have been involved in situations where a patient you were working with and supporting was left out of a critical conversation because of their communication impairment? So I hope that is everybody, because unfortunately it happens too much. But how do we make sure that we intersect with that? And how specifically is aphasia, does aphasia impact decision-making capacity, which is a basic human right to engage in your healthcare and to make your own choices to accept or refuse recommended clinical treatments. So people with aphasia typically have limited access to understandable aphasia-friendly health information and are often unable to make informed healthcare decisions. I know there are many professionals among us who have done great work at adapting informed consent materials, both for clinical interactions as well as for research. I think we need to continue to share and grow those, and also to really, understand how the trainings that have been described here with other health professionals can help to promote a person's autonomy and a person's ability to make decisions and choice for themselves. So this area in general, I think, reflects the core principles of interprofessional care, which also are developed to make sure that we have good, safe, quality practices in healthcare. Communication being the most critical of those. And of course, when somebody has difficulty with communication, it makes it very difficult. So next slide. So we want to think about some solutions. I know that we're getting toward the end of our time here. We've talked about a lot of them as well, but how do we think about health literacy? What kinds of programs, activities have you done, can you recommend that have helped impact health literacy and decision-making capacity? Or. I'll just give you an example once recently. So I serve as both the Chief Learning and Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Officer for our post-acute system in Boston. And it was raised recently, how do we make sure that signage in our buildings is accessible to individuals who don't speak English? And one of our responses was, if signage is created to be aphasia friendly, it will also meet those requirements to help people who have limited English, who are English language learners. So something that we can all, advocate for. Any other thoughts, any other programs you'd like to share? Okay, well, in the effort of, keeping us on target, maybe we can go to the next slide.
You bet.
I would just say that, again, this, picking up this resource tool in the 2.0 paper, I don't quite see the slide. There we go. In this 2.0 paper, will just give you an incredible amount of ideas. The authors layer in solutions. They describe problems. They describe the data that support those problems. And then they describe program solutions and data related to those solutions. So we really wanted to get everybody's ideas, but really sort of focus on solutions. Thinking about mitigating those impacts of low literacy, using universal access principles for communication materials, using health literacy evaluation tools. The CDC has incredible resources related to this. that are useful for all patients. And then we can think about that in the context of persons with aphasia and their needs. And then providing patient-centered accommodations that are specific to the individual, mitigating the impacts of limitations of informed consent, speech pathologists being involved in or supporting the evaluation of decision-making capacity examinations. We need to make sure that we recognize that these are state-regulated determinations, but they are clinical construct to help patients make decisions that they are able to make with good informed consent and understanding based on their ability to meet the criteria of decision-making capacity. We as speech language pathologists cannot be the determinant of whether or not a person has decision-making capacity, but we can give input and we can support that evaluation in a way that facilitates best understanding and communication for somebody with aphasia. And then providing communication support and strategies to maximize shared decision-making for persons with aphasia in all aspects, even if it's not a very weighty decision, but in all aspects of care and life, and consideration of primary language and working with interpreter services, making sure that we do that very rigorously and diligently. And then the last thing I would say is I appreciate so much how the authors delineated the different aspects of solutions in international support, governmental support and programs, professional standards, guidance, funding incentives, and legal precedents. So it is a really useful tool in that regard. And I'll turn it over to Tom to help wrap us up.
Thanks, Lynn and Michelle, and thanks all for really great discussions. Certainly this was centered around just a small portion of the revised aphasia research paper, but more importantly, what seems to be a common thread of why we get together at Aphasia Access or the Leadership Summit or the Bragging Steels is that we can learn from each other and learn about what people are doing concretely, and also share certainly some frustrations and shared experiences from the perspectives of clinicians and researchers and people with aphasia and family members. So thanks to you all for the great discussion. We wanted to be careful that our intent is not to say, and now for the low price, you can get the paper, because we wanted to have these conversations regardless of access to the paper. Having said that, given that approximately 5 years have passed, there's these massive revisions. So we are really excited to be able to discuss a bit about how this next version of the aphasia research paper is available. So I'm going to turn it over to Todd to discuss that just a bit as well.
Or what a wonderful discussion. I'm sure if Jamie and Nina had been here and been able to be here, there's some conflicts, they would have said the conversation was awesome. And really appreciated you, everyone jumping into the prompts and the questions that Michelle and Lynn and Tom offered. This paper is a little bit different, that it's going to be released in quarterly chunks, trying to tie to conversation and to bring it out. That was one of the things that the authors and the board and whatnot talked about wanting to change from last time, that this really is a living document. That's the one reason that you'll never see it presented that way. You'll see some things pulled out and trying to create conversation with that. And to that end, I know that Jamie and Nina will be looking at the tapes, looking at the chats, and there will be an addendum at the end that says, well, what did we as a community say about all of this? What was the conversation? And try to take it from version 1 to version 2, volume 2 here, but really to volume 2.2 or so, by virtue of the conversation. So it is available and it will be released. We're doing the final layouts in the first week of July, not January. Oh my gosh. Just finishing it up as we get over. But the piece I would say to that, if anything's an impediment to getting access to this, I hope you'll reach out to me privately and confidentially. Everyone who wants this is going to get this. We appreciate your support. We're happy to work with circumstances related to individual institutions and whatnot. So I'm going to pop the link. It's the last day of my kid's school today, so the brain is playing tricks on me, it seems, so that you can see it and you can go to it at your convenience and whatnot. It's coming in just a second here. And hopefully you'll subscribe to the paper. We're also going to be doing an infographic series that will tie to the release in the quarters. It's kind of our different version of an executive summary instead, because it's a little hard to do that on a quarterly basis. But when we do the last release in about a year, there will be an executive summary attached to it in that regard. So happy to answer questions offline with anybody. And like I said, and like Tom said, it matters to get it in people's hands, and we're going to make sure that happens. And we appreciate the support to keeping the lights on too.
Wonderful. Okay, gang. Well, thank you all for an excellent discussion. On behalf of Lynn and Michelle and Jackie Hinckley and myself, we want to express our appreciation to Jamie and Nina, and want to express our appreciation to all of you for the conversation and moving things forward in life participation. So with that being said, certainly reach out to us if you have questions.
And don't forget, on the 27th, we had so many Bragg and Steel submissions. We're doing it twice this month. If you were on the first one, it was great. It's a little bit of a different approach as we welcome folks with aphasia from our community and whatnot, but 27th, please join us.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks all. Happy Aphasia Awareness Month. Thanks all for being on. Reach out if you have questions. Otherwise, we will shut it down for the day. So have a great rest of the day. Thanks, everybody.